and other partner countries. Against this background, I'm very pleased to be hosting today at UN House for this Human Rights Talk, which we are organizing in partnership with the European Economic and Social Committee, the EU's voice of civil society. Let me welcome and pass the floor to the President of the European Economic and Social Committee, Mr. Oliver Robke, who will deliver introductory remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, dear Ms. Tapiero, for the nice introductory words, and dear guests, dear distinguished panelists. And if he's online, I would also say hello to the High Commissioner, because recently we had the pleasure to meet him in Geneva. First of all, I would like to thank you for this initiative and for involving the Economic and Social Committee as a co-host for this kick-off event. I think this is a big honor for us, and we see this also as a recognition of the work that we have done in the recent years in the field of fundamental rights, democracy, and rule of law. So we are really pleased to be here with you and to participate in this meeting, in this debate. I would say one reason is also that I put a lot of emphasis on the protection of democracy, rule of law, and also on protecting the space for civil society organizations within the European Union, but also beyond. Those are key features of my manifesto, and I will do really everything to support all initiatives to make sure that civil society organizations will have enough space and even growing space to raise their voice in Europe. I think shrinking space for civil society is always shrinking space for democracy. And in the end, I just refer to the Porto Social Forum, which took place last weekend. We know that even highly established organizations, social partners, risk to lose influence and to lose space if there is not enough space for civil society and also for civil dialogue. So therefore, I'm really glad to participate in this meeting, and I think overall it's a fantastic initiative, this Human Rights 75, to advance the promise of freedom, equality, and justice. And once again, I'd like to thank High Commissioner because we spoke about a stronger involvement of our committee, and I hope that this is a starting point. We are very much interested to cooperate with you, with the United Nations human rights in the field of democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law. I just saw in your background paper one quote from the UN General Secretary in his call to action for human rights, where he said, where he identified public participation and civic space as a priority area in the pursuit of the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I couldn't agree more, and therefore I'm happy that civic space and civil society is today I would say in the center of this debate, because we know that in the past years these values, society, freedom, have been put under strain. I would say also because of a succession of crises of various nature and the parallel rise of social and economic inequalities. But it's my firm belief that we all together, we can improve things together. And therefore I would really ask ourselves and call ourselves to use this celebration of the 75 years of the Universal Declaration as an opportunity to concretely reflect on how to better connect international human rights law and actual policy making. I mentioned already the Porto Social Forum, and I think it's worth to highlight that in the end there was an open letter or an open statement which was signed by almost all political leaders, I think almost all EU ministers for social affairs, but also by the social partners, by Business Europe, by ETUC, so by the trade unions, and I think there was strong to bring also in the field of social policy or in the field of the European Pillar of Social Rights, to bring the principles to realization, because in the end, it's about ensuring the participation and inclusion of all people. And I think this is the reason why we have to work together. I also think that economic and social rights cannot be disconnected from civil and political rights. They need positive action by authorities to be fulfilled. And if I say positive actions, then I think they are prompted by better participation. And the nexus between participation and human rights, from my point of view, is twofold. On the one hand, the right to take part in public affairs. This is a right in itself, codified also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But on the other hand, participation is also a necessary tool to empower individuals to know, claim, and enjoy the fulfillment of all their other rights. I think in this perspective, the EESC is a huge position to act as a gateway between citizens, civil society, and EU institutions. Therefore, we call ourselves House of Organized Civil Society in the EU. And my plan is also together with the colleagues in the EESC, especially with the Fundamental Rights Group, and I'm really pleased that the new president Söte is also present here, to reinforce the role of this Fundamental Rights and Rule of Law group in order to act somehow as a watchdog for democracy. I was really pleased that recently France 24 called our committee as the EU's democracy watchdog. I'm sure we are not alone. There are several watchdogs, but I think we will do everything to meet these expectations. 2 points at the end to conclude. I think the point rethinking participation to enhance civic space and human rights means that we should do much more to foster a joint European culture of human rights and the rule of law. And when I say, well, what do I mean with culture? I think, or I mean a set of beliefs that is widely understood and shared by the general population and that influences its daily practices. And we are working on it. Our Fundamental Rights and Rule of Law group has undertaken already missions in almost all EU member states to meet there with stakeholders. More than 600 representatives of civil society were interviewed, and we met them in the different countries. So civil society organizations, NGOs, social partners, media and legal professionals, and so on. And I think we will now complete and finish this mission, the set of mission this year. And I think it gives a very good picture about the state of play of human rights and rule of law in. But if I say in the EU, let me also allow, I think we should also look beyond the EU, very much to the global situation. But for us as Europeans, and for me as president of the EESC, it's one of my key priorities to focus on enlargement countries. I think this is important at a very early stage to empower civil society organizations there, to help them there to build up robust structures already now, and not to wait too long until a concrete accession could come. I think we can't do it early enough. So therefore, we are really looking into possibilities to cooperate closer with civil society representatives from those countries, including the possibility to involve them already in our daily work, in our institutional work. I think we would be the first EU institution, and I think this would be very much important to give those civil society organizations there also a stronger voice. Finally, I want to stress that in order to secure the rights of individuals, we must give them, as well as the organizations, that they represent, a voice. And this means, once again, civil society organizations. We have to support them. We have to empower them. This is, of course, one of our key priorities and key tasks as European Economic and Social Committee. And one way to do this would be also by creating a strong forum, a European civil society forum on human rights, and better integrating civil society in policy making. We as EESC, we stand ready to support this and to participate in such an initiative. So I think, or I hope, that it's the right time to start also with this initiative. Once again, thank you very much for yeah, for co-hosting this important debate. I wish you a fruitful debate. I really look forward to the conclusions and to continue the cooperation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ropier, and thank you for reminding us about the basic discussion with generally with space, because the yeah, it's like the, and we shouldn't take things for granted. Inclusive, effective, and sustainable participation as a core component of a thriving civic space and as a means to the greater enjoyment of human rights in Europe and beyond. I'm delighted to have with us 4 distinguished panelists who kindly accepted to share their views and experiences for our exchange today. Starting from my right, Ms. Chiara Damo, Head of Unit for Gender Equality, Human Rights and Democratic Governance at the Directorate General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. Ms. Alexandrina Nazmovic, Secretary General of the European Civic Forum. Ms. Ingrid Belander Todino, Head of Unit for Fundamental Rights Policy at the Fundamental Rights and Democracy at the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers in the European Commission. And Mr. Ken. Let me start as she leads the implementation of the European Commission's democracy support programs in partner countries. Chiara, we mentioned that promote democracy and good governance to advance human rights and sustainable development. This office has recommended that specific strategies for the promotion and protection of political and public participation be developed with the framework of international cooperation and assistance programs, and should include a focus on engaging with people from marginalized groups. Can you tell us a bit more about the EU's vision and approach to participation underlying the EU's intervention in partner countries? What are your priorities? Who are the actors who seek engagement? How do you measure impact? Thank you.
From our perspective externally, we do have a strategy on which we inherited, so to say, from your office. Is the human rights-based approach methodology to enabling international partnerships. Right. So in sum, for the web, I think it's the same as before. Okay, I keep on going. So I hope online you can also hear what I'm saying, not just watching me talking. But just to say, we have developed this human rights-based approach methodology, which cuts across all our actions and particularly also all our programs in terms of project cycle from identification to evaluation. And that is a result of our partnership with the OECHR, the UN Office on Human Rights. We also very much discussed with the Danish Institute on Human Rights when this came to the fore, and it was just renewed recently after COVID, or in the aftermath of COVID in the summer 2021. What is this and what does it mean? It's a bit what the President was mentioning. I mean, participation is a right in itself, a human right on its own value, but it's also an enabling condition for all other human rights to be fulfilled, and in our own approach for actually sustainable development to have a full impact. So two of the core principles of this human rights-based approach are meaningful and inclusive participation, here you go, and non-discrimination. So if you combine both, that's what we really strive to apply to all our actions. In practice, it means that we have developed a methodology, and our staff also in delegations and here as a panoply of shortlists, checklists, guidance, documents, and knowledge to make sure that what we do from health to infrastructure does apply this principle, involves civil society in meaningful consultation. So make sure that we look at all groups and needs, roles and needs. So we look at different groups in the population, and very much the consultation of civil society help us to inform this analysis. If I take, for instance, women, this is more or less half of the world population, and there is a big risk very often that half of the world population is left behind. So in order to achieve results there, what we need to push, and we are pushing for, is this gender transformative approaches. In a nutshell, it's a big word to say that we need really to look at the underlying barriers and norms that actually are there to impede the full enjoyment of these actions. I was saying we have these strategies. I mean, in terms of the approach to civil society, we have a communication which dates since 2012 and really put civil society as actors of governance in the external action. But then more recently, the European Commission put forward in this term the Youth Action Plan in External Relations and the Gender Action Plan. Youth, young people have been very much in the forefront of our efforts in reaching out and really meaningfully engage and co-create, I would say, with civil society actors. And I'm very pleased that also your campaign for the 75th anniversary is very much geared toward hearing the voices of the youth. One example I can give in terms of successes so far in terms of participation at the multilateral level in the preparation to the Summit of Democracy organized by President Biden. As European Commission, we decided to co-lead a cohort devoted to youth, civic and political participation alongside the civil society such as EPD. I have Ken here. And he can also tell more. Civil society from all the continents, Nepal, Costa Rica, Ghana. So it was really a meaningful way then not only to involve them in the preparation of the event and give them a voice to the event, but also build a follow-up to that. So we now have this network of very committed young people and civil society to bring work forward. At the regional level, our role is really about building bridges and making civil society actors learning from each other, getting together and also supporting each other, from networks of journalists to helping to support themselves and manage different threats to, for instance, this Africtivist with organization active in 40 African countries, working on civic tech and so on. At the country level, we have a structured approach, and with that I end, because we engage with the partner countries everywhere where the EU delegations are present and ensure to adopt a civil society roadmap. And that is really opening doors for dialogue between civil societies and communities, people and the governments, and give communities a seat at the table. For that, I had, for instance, Sierra Leone, where we supported this 400 CSO network called NEW, Network of Election Watch, which really now has a seat at the table there.
Thank you very much, Chiara. And I will continue with Ken Godfrey, who is the director of the European Partnership for Democracy, a not-for-profit democracy support organization that brings together a network of 18 organizations conducting advocacy, research, and programs inside and outside Europe. And what I would like to say is that we see a rise in authoritarianism, shrinking civic space, and persisting inequalities, which we witness in many countries within and outside the European Union. This can severely frustrate efforts to promote participation at all levels. Which main obstacles do you see currently standing in the way of the right to participate in public affairs, and which avenues to go around them, including in terms of innovative partnerships and participatory tools?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I hope nothing's going to explode. No, we're good. My organization, so we work on supporting democracy around the world. That includes support for civic space within Europe, but also outside. One of the things I would just say from the outset is that with regards to participation, of course, it's sort of been mentioned already, but it's heavily dependent on other rights too. So freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, also freedom of information. And so all of these, I think, bar none, are under attack across the world in general. Of course, this is not the case everywhere in the world, but as a general trend, these rights and freedoms are under threat. And what we can see is that there's sort of those trends have an impact on participation. Number one, because of the fact that it closes an ability to participate. So very clearly closes ability to participate through voting, for example, which is maybe the most emblematic, but also, for example, there are attacks on marginalized groups and therefore particular or even underrepresented groups in general. Their ability to participate actively in public life is undermined. And here when we speak about, so if I take underrepresented women, and we've mentioned youth, with regards to youth, I think that there are legal barriers, which are, many people would advocate for voting from the age of 16. In most countries of the world, that is not the case. It's older. In Belgium, actually, it's just changed for the European Parliament elections. It will be from the age of 16. There are other countries around Europe which have voting from the age of 16, but there are barriers to young people under the age of 18 to be involved in political life. At the same time, there's also issues of political culture. At the same time, sort of the how valorized, how people take the voice of young people in politics. I think the same with regards to participation as candidates. So most countries around the world, they would mostly be in political life. There are men who are assuming positions within political parties. So there's a lot of work to do with regards to political parties. Some have what they call zipper list, which is female, male. They would alternate. There are examples of that within Europe, but also outside. So there are many steps that can be taken. None of them are perfect, but there are ways in which to promote different levels of participation. With regards to sort of combating it, sort of examples, what we've seen is that there's a use of digital tools to encourage participation. So there are many different examples of that, but just broadly speaking, one could say that these digital tools are not in themselves a solution. They try and enhance participation in existing democratic processes. So potentially this is voting, although there's lots of controversy over electronic voting and how successful it is. But in general, that's one application of the use of digital technologies, and there are many more. As well as what we would see as attempts at, you mentioned partnerships, so attempts by civic groups and opposition parties to engage together in the advance of human rights or rule of law, democracy, in response to what we would call democratic backsliding or autocratization in a specific country. And we've seen many examples of that across the world. Basically, people assuming power democratically and then undermining democracy from this position of power. And therefore, one of the ways to try and halt that and encourage sort of greater participation is through these partnerships. One caveat to that, though, is that many of those people who assume power democratically are not necessarily always looking to restrict participation. What they might try and do is encourage participation in some parts of the country where they have a base, a solid base. This could be ethnically divided, or it could be economically, or they would seek a certain part of the polity of the political system in order to encourage participation there and restrict participation in other parts of the political system. So sometimes this is capital city and regional areas. Sometimes this is a particular region of the country, and then another area the polling booths are not so accessible. And we see this in sort of more wealthy democracies and also in other states around the world.
Thank you very much. There's been a recent workshop done by the Droit Subcommittee of the European Parliament on illiberal political systems and authoritarian regimes. And I would be interested to hear on a bit more on how we can counteract this distortion of electoral processes in illiberal political systems to strengthen participation, because the risk of actually making the process, legitimizing the process is very high.
It's a very tricky question. There are many different attempts, I think, to combat this autocratization or democratic backsliding. Some of them are to compete in elections through these partnerships. So we saw in Turkey very, very recently an example of an opposition coalition coming together and unsuccessfully challenging during the elections. However, at the same time, that group was also in different formations, but successful at the regional level in mayoral races in the capital, Ankara, and also in Istanbul and other parts of the country. And we've seen that within the European Union as well. In Czech Republic, there was a successful coalition. In Hungary, it was unsuccessful. So there are attempts being made to do that. At the same time, there are also, when I was mentioning digital tools, we've looked at innovations and the use of digital tools to promote participation. And what we've seen is a different mix. So sometimes those tools are used to expand existing consultative processes in democratic politics, so petitions or just consultative bodies. Sometimes there are very open forms of participation. So across Latin America, for example, there's a lot of deliberative democracy, so participatory budgeting, but also at the national level, regional level, where they involve lots of different citizens. In Europe, what's all the rage is citizen assemblies. So this is sortition, which is tirage au sort, which means that you pick people by lot. It's like a jury, randomly selected people. They come and they can participate in democratic processes. And sometimes this is linked to representative democracy as well, and not separate to representative democracy. Across the African continent, there are many examples of the use of digital tools to try and hold people to account through crowdsourcing, so getting more people involved in playing watchdog roles. So there are many different examples that we can see across the world. What I would say is that there's not one answer. There's not one answer. But what's key is experimenting, is trying to see what are the different ways in which we could try to hold either a backsliding government to account or push them out of office, and that's a series of trial and error processes, essentially, in many different states.
Thank you so much. Turning now to Ingrid Belander Todino, Head of Unit for Fundamental Rights Policy at the European Commission. We said that participation is key for sound policy making and to strengthen institutions' democratic legitimacy. This is even more so for international international and regional entities which rely on participation to inform decision making in light of local and national concerns conveyed by rights and stakeholders. The UN Human Rights Office has also underlined the unique role these entities have to play in galvanizing diverse actors and making space for marginalized voices whose voices may not be heard at the local and national levels. The UN itself has strived to enhance the meaningful participation of civil society actors through strengthening partnerships, and those efforts continue and deepen, also building on the UN guidance note on the protection and promotion of civic space, which the UN Human Rights Office has just issued. The European Union is a very interesting case study. Ensuring inclusive, meaningful, and continuous participation in all its different dimensions must be a real challenge in a big, complex, and multi-layered regional reality. How is the EU implementing and promoting participation within its own institutions and member states? And which are the flagship initiatives and tools underlying these efforts? And it would be interesting to hear, of course, about participation of women and other groups. Nice situation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you. Also, thank you for inviting us here today. We have, Chiara has explained the external side, and now I will focus more on the internal, the EU and the institutional side of the civic space and participation in particular. I think that is clear from the work of the Commission since the past few years, is that we all agree that civil society organizations and human rights defenders need to work in an enabling environment where they are protected, supported, and empowered to participate in policy making. That applies, of course, as you said, both within the EU institutions, but also at the member state level. So that is clear that we are working towards this. Last year in December, my team, we published the annual report on the application of the Fundamental Rights Charter, which was dedicated to a thriving civic space for upholding fundamental rights in the EU. There, one of the key messages was that civil society actors need to participate in the public policy decision to be empowered. As we have heard my previous colleagues here saying, that is really one of the key components of our democracies, and making all the policy making at the EU and the world level working. It's also a means to allow public authorities to take evidence-informed decisions. That's strengthened, again, we heard the representative democracy and the legitimacy of decisions taken by the public decision makers. This has also been affirmed in the Commission's Rule of Law report, that the inclusiveness of legislative processes and civil society involvement is an indicator of the respect of the rule of law. So it's absolutely key to what we're doing at all levels in decision and policy making. In this charter report last year, we recognized the role of CSOs and human rights defenders and the need to enable them to act and make sure that conditions are in place so they can meaningfully be involved in decision making and implementing national EU policies that benefit our democracy. So it's part is participation, but the other part of it is, of course, the protection, the enabling role that we have to protect these actors. We also heard when we prepared the report that stakeholders indicate that it's not that easy to participate. It's difficult to access consultations. It's difficult to participate in dialogues. in some member states. And I must also acknowledge not always perfect at the institutional level either. So I think both within our institutions at the EU level and in the member states, we really need to have a think about what we can do better and improve this means for participation. So in order to support member states, we are now preparing for adoption next week a Defense of Democracy package. This is a package that is composed of legislative and non-legislative measures to strengthen resilience to covert foreign interference in our democratic life, and also to encourage citizens and civil society actors to participate in our democracies. Because the basis for this is that engaged, informed, and empowered citizens and civil society organizations and human rights defenders are an essential guarantee for the resilience of our democracies. So to give you a little teaser for what's coming, I can focus on the part that I have been responsible for, is a recommendation on promoting the engagement and effective participation of citizens and civil society organizations in public policy-making processes. This recommendation will encourage member states to develop a structured approach to participation processes that are tailored for citizens and civil society organizations, and also based on existing best practice and the tools that you have mentioned. These should be done through predictable, accessible, transparent, and inclusive frameworks to allow as broad and as targeted, both broad and targeted participation at the same time. You mentioned specific groups, so those groups have to be able to participate by making these channels accessible, inclusive, etc. We also encourage member states to build strategic partnerships between public authorities at the local, regional, and national levels, and civil society organizations. And establish structured dialogues with civil society organizations on specific topics related to public policy-making processes, going beyond consultation for specific policy measures only, but have a more regular and long-lasting and result-oriented approach. And another example of this recommendation is to also provide the necessary support and these instruments to enable meaningful participation. For example, through dedicated funding and capacity building activities. But to enable participation, again, we need to protect the civic space. So we have also included in the recommendation measures to prompt member states to create and maintain a safe and enabling environment for civil society organizations and human rights defenders. For example, the recommendation will address steps to protect CSOs and human rights defenders, their staff and volunteers, and the close ones working with these in these organizations that are facing attacks, and to monitor the development in the civic space, ensure access to support services, and dedicate specific funding to build the capacity to face threats, and also how to become more resilient in the face of threats and the shrinking civic space. And also we are encouraging member states to adopt action plans or equivalent strategic planning on how this protection will be done. So based on this recommendation to member states, we are intending to continue and follow up this, support member states to implement this recommendation, and I really hope that this can be a as important and further developed policy in the next mandate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a follow-up question. I was interested in reading the report on the future of Europe and the number of consultations that took place with civil society and with citizens in each European Union member state. And it's striking to me that, you know, it seems that institutionally there is a willingness at least to consult and get civic society on board, but in individual EU countries, what resonates is that there is a disconnect with what the EU institutions are doing in Brussels and what they feel are their priorities. So I was wondering, how can we build this, build a bridge between this disconnect? And also, I suppose, something that we also think about in terms of our own messaging is how to make the messages accessible, because the language we use is not always the clearest, the easiest, or, you know, we should think about children and make it child-friendly. We should think about persons with different types of disabilities. We should think about persons who speak different languages. So how do we bridge that gap? Thank you.
I wish I had the full answer, but I think step by step, I think we are trying to do that through the rule of law report follow-up. For example, we have dialogues at the national level involving the Commission's representative offices. For example, there are civil dialogues there. On children's rights, we're just now setting up a child participation platform, which will help children participate in the policy making both at EU and national level. So that's an initiative under the EU strategy on the rights of the child that will be operational now within a couple of months or so. And then, of course, I think those channels that are existing should be more empowered and be involved. Maybe the risk is also to have the silo approach that women's rights only speak with these. The problem is always that we speak to those who are already convinced. Maybe the challenge is also to cut across, and that's why I think that your organizations are very important, because you can represent the fuller value-based work that can involve many different sectors, so to speak.
Thank you. Moving on to Alexandrina Nazmavovic, just recalling that she's the Secretary General of the European Civic Forum, a pan-European network of nearly 100 associations and non-governmental organizations across 29 European countries, who have been at the forefront of advocacy campaigns towards the EU institutions, calling for more efforts to promote and protect civic space and improve civil dialogue in the region. Alexandrina, as the hands-on experience of your organization and your members will confirm, existing participation channels and tools may often look good on paper, but be frustrated by gaps and limitations in practice. Recent studies point to the fact that while the EU has strengthened and modernized its participatory infrastructure, offering citizens increasing ways to participate in EU politics over time, there are gaps, and the effectiveness and impact of those instruments or campaigns and the need for stronger political commitment towards participation may be necessary. And I have some data here from post-electoral Eurobarometer surveys which show that, for example, electoral mobilization for EU elections, despite that it has improved from 2019, it remains rather weak compared to national elections. And then there are great country disparities. While EU citizens, and in particular underrepresented groups, express the wish of having a bigger say in EU policy making. So if that's the case, what works, what doesn't work, and what can we do more?
Wow.
Thank you for the introduction. Maybe I will start with the big picture and then I will zoom in to participation both as a right and as a process. So regarding the big picture, I would like to pick up on what Oliver said in the beginning related to the culture of human rights. I really think that in our societies today we experiment an erosion or let's say disruption of the consensus on the universality of rights. And this we see also as a consequence of policies that are in place or lack of policies that do not manage to ensure precisely what you put at the center of human rights, which is equality, inclusion, and justice for all. So we have many people that are being or feel being left aside. And as Oliver said, there's also an erosion of social dialogue. So on one hand, we are losing ground on the processes and we are also losing some rights. If I'm thinking about workers' rights, precarity of work, along the flexibility of the labor market, there's a big issue. And then, so I was mentioning the policies, but then also the reactionary reaction, not only to this situation, but in general, when people are put in competition for rights and equality and dignity, the reactionary come with solutions that are often based on exclusion and on a selective access to rights of some against others, be them native against newcomers, be them traditional versus modern, or be them family against gender and reproductive rights. And we see this all over the place in Europe and in the world. The rise of these social movements and political forces that are promoting actually alternative models of society that go completely against the universality of rights. But in the same time, they reclaim themselves as defenders of rights, which really is very problematic and which poses a lot of challenges both to rights defenders and to the institutions that must ensure the frameworks for the accessibility of rights. I'm saying this also because this balance, and of course we are gaining rights. I mean, let's be honest. We are gaining rights in some areas. We are gaining rights in the LGBT communities, while in the same time we are losing in the same area. We are gaining rights on gender equality, equal pay, etc., etc. But I think that in the society, the perception of the balance between the two is quite uneven, and so I think the notion of trust in democracy is really endangered by this. And I think that this is at the core of what participation should restore, trust in democracy. So there's a huge role both for the institutions and for civil society to play. And again, here I would like to reaffirm what has already been said. There's no enjoyment possible of civil and political rights without enjoyment of socioeconomic rights. So we cannot expect people to participate from those groups that are really at the margins of our societies and whose rights are sometimes denied, to have the capacity, the means, the know-how and the tools. Of course, there are organizations who are there to stand up for the rights, but we want to stand up with. So we really need to create the conditions in the society for those people to be able to participate. And there's no participation without enabling environment. So here I would also like to be very positive on the progress that we made. I've been here in this house 5 years ago when we celebrated 70 years of the Universal Declaration, and we were discussing we were starting to discuss challenges to civic space. And look, in 5 years, we have several initiatives. We have the European Rule of Law report. We have the first ever charter report dedicated to civic space, council conclusions on civic space, and the upcoming Defense of Democracy Pact, to which in civil society we look at both with much hope, and I'm really, really so happy to hear your first teaser and to see some keywords that are very dear to our ears, like structured dialogue and participation, financing and capacity building of organizations and people to participate. So we are really looking with very much interest towards this recommendation to member states. Hopefully there will be some recommendations also to the EU to improve participation and dialogue practices. But, and I cannot refrain from expressing some worries that civil society widely shares regarding possible risks that we see in this package that stem from the Foreign Interference Directive. Of course, we've been discussing with the institutions since the beginning, not really the beginning of the year, but for a few months we've been discussing making our worries known to the institutions and constantly receiving reassurance that yes, there will be safeguards in the package. Yes, this package will no be the EU FARA legislation by no means. And of course, we believe that the institutions will do their utmost to ensure this. But the fact is that we haven't seen a text. The fact is that there has been no impact assessment around it, and it's very difficult to really be reassured. We really feel that there is a risk for this instrument to be weaponized by authoritarian leaders, and not only because what we see through our analysis of civic space in Europe is that there is a tendency to look at civil society with suspicion, and not only in Hungary and in Poland, really in all the democracies, and to shift from affirming the freedom to associate, the freedom to assembly, to suspecting civil society by definition through different kinds of legislation. I will just name the legislation, recent legislation in France, the separatism bill, which really casts a suspicion generally on civil society, asking any organization who would claim any public funding to sign a kind of charter of Republican values, as if the freedom of association codified by the French law would not be enough. So unfortunately, the transparency itself is weaponized by a lot of governments to actually impose restrictions on civil society. So we are very much afraid that this legislation, no matter the safeguards and the good intentions that are behind it, will be weaponized. But let's wait and see. Let's see the text, and let's hope that we will manage to mitigate these possible negative consequences. And just to end on, I really think that at the European level we need to reach scale and to go beyond consultation. To what is lacking really is really a structured framework for dialogue with civil society. We have a basis in the treaty, Article 11, but we don't have structures that across the DGs, across services in the Commission, and even across the institutions implement this dialogue in the same way. So I would really call for an interinstitutional agreement between EU institutions on how to dialogue with civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this suggestion. And definitely if we look at the Universal Declaration, all rights are included. So civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And of course, the rights, they reinforce each other, they're interdependent, they're mutually reinforcing and indivisible. And it is a concern of course, to both us and you that the very principle of the universality of rights is put into question. But like you, I would also ask our panelists on, what can be done to come back to basics, because we're speaking about equality and non-discrimination, and when those are put into question, then we really have a long way to go if this is our starting point. So perhaps going backwards from this end. Ken?
Can you repeat? You mean
what can we do to reinforce the universality of rights and our common values?
It's a very big question. So I don't. One of the things I would say is what I was speaking about before is that this undermining of the universality of human rights is very much being used by what I would call sort of political entrepreneurs. So people who are entering the political scene, and they're using this as a tactic, a device to divide, basically, and to ensure that a certain portion of the electorate, which maybe agrees with this, will vote for them, and they know that they will always vote for them. Here I'm very much speaking, I think, about European Union, but it applies also outside of the European Union. And this has proved to be, unfortunately, a very successful electoral strategy. At the same time, I firmly believe that this only gives a percentage of votes within a political society. It's never going to give a majority, in my opinion, but potentially it could, but I do not think that this is the case. And as a result, what often happens on European continent is that they require alliances, they require coalitions, people who are undermining this. And I think that it's very important to maintain a cordon sanitaire, so something that there is not cooperation with political entrepreneurs that are using this to mobilize certain voters. So this is one way that I would think I think is very important. But of course, it's not the only way to combat this. Another one, I think, is something that the European Union has been addressing. It's not in Ingrid's unit, but you're definitely concerned by it. But it's everything that's happening in the digital sphere. So there have been a number of attempts with the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, online transparency of political advertising, now the AI Act, to get a better grip on the type of discourse that happens online that undermines human rights, to know where it's coming from, who is funding it, because often it is not individuals. Of course, many times it is, but it is controlled, coordinated disinformation that is being used. And the European Union, because of the size of the market in Europe, has a very important role to play at the international level, and has been doing so. We've seen now Twitter this week decided to pull out of the Code of Practice on Disinformation. There will be further repercussions of the attempts of the European Union to regulate the digital sphere. But I firmly believe that it is in the interests of human rights in the long run for the European Union to be doing this.
Yeah, I think indeed it's a very big question, and I was recently at the conference where we discussed the institutional protection of human rights in the aftermath or during crisis. And I think what it comes down to when you listen and discuss this is, first of all, communication, and that speak the language of people so they understand. If you say human rights, sometimes it sounds very abstract. But when you start saying what does it actually mean? During COVID, the fact that you could not go out of your house is a violation of your human rights. And then people really understand that, yeah, it is. So and then also coming back to who are we speaking to? And of course, the children and the young people, education and all this awareness raising in those groups are absolutely key to make this kind of a mainstream problem and an opportunity. And then, of course, from our role as policymakers to mainstream fundamental rights throughout all policies, and indeed we are very closely working with our colleagues in the digital area. And I would see, for example, now in the climate change, we have not really started addressing that, but that's also something that what is the fallout from all of those problems on fundamental rights, universal human rights?
So, continuing with the level of civil society, I think that this is somewhat what civil society does on an everyday basis, actually, through the work that we do, trying to ensure, inclusiveness, equality, that actually everybody has access to rights. And we do this through advocacy, we do this through service provision, whatever the kind of activities. And it sometimes is difficult even for us, we realize inside civil society, to identify ourselves as right defenders or working to ensure access to rights. And in my organization, for example, we really are very keen to build awareness of the interlinks between the work that civil society does, the way that actually it ensures access to rights and rebuilds trust in democracy. Now, at the side of the institutions, I really think that the institutions need to demonstrate simply that democracy works for people. We need to reinvigorate democracy, not only in the way that democracy works, of course, through injecting more participation mechanisms, but also through the policies that institutions deliver. concretely for the European Union, I think there's really need to go beyond the merely economic dimension of the EU and reach scale to a real integration on social policies and social issues, including more resources in common to do so, because social policy is left at the responsibility of member states. And we know how huge disparities are in Europe between member states and even inside countries between regions. So I really think this is key. Democracy, we need to demonstrate that democracy can deliver for all.
Thank you very much, Samantha Chaitkin, who's replaced Chiara Adamo.
Thank you. Yes, it is a big question indeed. And I think it makes me think of 50 years after the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The UN also made a declaration about defending human rights 25 years ago. And this is something I think that we will continue really to work on, encouraging people to become human rights defenders, to defend human rights. Both citizens and CSOs, individuals and communities, to insist upon human rights. And how do we do this when it seems so risky? One of the things we will continue to do is to work on protection of human rights defenders and of CSOs, encourage enabling environments for civic space and for defense of human rights, but also to encourage and enable younger generations to see defending human rights as something they are willing to become engaged in, as something worth it, as try to lower some of the risks to getting engaged in human rights. So this is something that we're really prioritizing through our youth action plan, but also some programs to really focus on encouraging young people to exercise and enjoy their association and assembly rights more safely, legally, and to insist upon them.
Thank you very much. The High Commissioner reminds us that promoting human rights is not only the right thing to do, but it should be the smart thing to do. And I wish we could find ways to get this message out to youth or younger groups of individuals who are, of course, the future. As we have a few minutes left, I would like to turn to the audience and perhaps take some questions, perhaps from those that we haven't heard from, any youth representatives that are with us. Please raise your hand and identify yourselves. We have our panelists will be delighted.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, my name is Alexandra Mihailovic. I'm from the National Youth Council of Serbia, so I would be the beyond part, I guess, of this conference. Thank you so much for holding this. It was like, honestly, the most important thing for me as somebody who is considered still young and who is working in the civic sector. I think it's really important to see that you all stand behind actually promote youth engagement, and that there is like a clear and consistent motivation that's coming from the institutions and other organizations, that they want to focus on youth and they want to basically help them participate more and help them become these defenders of democracy. For me, I think coming from a context that is definitely backsliding and stuff that you were talking about before, I think for me it was always the question of like how you can adapt these policies to these contexts, because it's so diverse. And it's not that Serbia has the same issues as, I don't know, North Macedonia or Hungary or whatever country. I think it's about how you make it adaptable to these contexts so that we can actually take full use of the instruments or packages that you provide for us. But also I think somebody has mentioned the language and the accessibility of these things, because as somebody working for the Youth Council, we often have to, even in the civic sector in Serbia, we have to sort of compete, let's use that word, with other organizations, CSOs, that are much more stronger than us and have a stronger tradition and partnerships. So oftentimes we wouldn't get, or we couldn't get packages or instruments for us just because of the size that we are and our like experience and whatnot. So basically, I think just making them more accessible to organizations that are actually led by youth or even other people coming from vulnerable groups. So basically just meaning, okay, we need to have these more funding and more opportunities for organizations that are youth-led or for youth specifically. So these are the things that are like really important to us, because as much as we want the rest of the civic society and for institutions for it to be like a multi-sectoral cooperation, we still need stuff to be done by us. And I think that also connects to the thing that like, if you want more participation, it needs to be done by youth. We need to see that the stuff we do actually matters to you and that you listen to that voice that comes directly from youth and not a different sort of representative. So yeah, that's my comment on that.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from the floor? Please, yes.
Thank you very much. I actually have more of a question to the whole panel, actually. I'm Ismail from the Confederation of European Senior Expert Services. We're an international network of national NGOs around Europe that mainly work on a senior expert volunteering basis. So senior people with lots of years of experience in every single sector of society, economic, cultural, even political, actually, that work on a global scale. So we cover lots of countries around the world. And I want to take a few things that have been said on the panel. I think Ms. Naimovic, sorry for slaughtering the name, you said more or less around the words of you can't have civil rights without socioeconomic rights, right? And when we speak about human rights, we are speaking about the universality of human rights. I think Mr. Godfrey actually spoke about that before and how to actually apply that to other continents. I know we're speaking a lot about Europe here, but I want to remind that Europe is less than 10% of the population around the world. And if we speak about human rights, we need to actually look beyond that. And I'm happy to say, well, I think that I'm right in saying this, that continental Europe, European Union also, most senses is most advanced when it comes to applying civil rights mechanisms, human rights mechanisms within the EU, in political participation of young people, in volunteering, in active civic space participation, etc. We have lots of expertise, tools, and mechanisms that we can actually help other people around the world, or for lack of a better term, mentor and cooperate with them again with a non-colonial perspective. I myself have been in these situations where I've been there, and if we take the examples of, going to take for instance the inclusion of women in the labor market, when that happened, we saw a direct increase in economic prosperity within those countries, right? I don't believe that's a coincidence. I've seen that also on a smaller scale myself in some countries that I've been in, is that when women are included in the labor market, that their economic prosperity in the family increases, they're a lot more open to these, let's say, human rights in I feel sorry to say, but mostly with an economic incentive, right? And I think the EU can do a lot of things for this. I'm very happy that Erasmus Plus decided to expand, let's say, the program and also allow the participation of third countries in it. But there's not a clear strategy of the EU specifically for international partnerships or cooperation. There's the African Continental Qualifications Framework, among a few things being done, but the EU does not give the tools for European civil society to expand, let's say, or to share their knowledge and things that have worked, again, also with youth participation, like mentioned before, around the world. So that's a bit my question a bit. What can be done from an institutional perspective and on the side of political will to help European civil society organizations to expand their knowledge, let's say, and their expertise on a global scale? It's a very broad question, so really to the whole panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a complex question. Any more participants from the audience?
I very recently arrived taking the post of anti-racial discrimination advisor with the office, and I've been transferred from Latin America. And in one way or another, I'm kind of glad to see that here you are tackling the same problems about which there has been probably over 25 years of discussion in Latin America, and to see that the two worlds are not quite separate. So I wanted to touch upon a couple of topics some of them are topics on which we will have to definitely work together. One of them is how do we ensure that participation is not only meaningful at the stage of giving input for the definition of public policy, but also it's meaningful at the stage of giving follow-up of the implementation of policy and at the stage of monitoring and evaluation. And I don't know yet, since I just recently arrived, what is the experience here in Europe, but usually civil society participates, or it's very much used by governments to participate at the level of definition of public policy because it's the right thing to do so. But later on in the policy, their voices are not necessarily well reflected. So it's the big question of how do we close the cleft between good intentions and discourse and really effective mainstreaming of the voices. Here are young people, for example, in public policy. So if we can trace some sort of route of working on these topics. And then the question of gender also is something that is catching very much my attention. I was just calculating more or less how many we are here. And excluding the fact that here at the last line we have been coming in and out of the room, we have on average 9 males and 17 females. So this looks very much okay as advancing in the policy of including women in the public sphere. But then you were speaking again about how the voices of women are not very well represented when they have to be represented. And from here, I want to jump to another topic, since, of course, a lot of you have been speaking about equality and inclusion of people from different ethnic backgrounds. Also, I think we have to think a little bit of how to include those people in our own events. Here, we don't have any people, for example, from African descent, and we don't have people from any other minority groups. I don't know how many people are following us on the networks. So how do we, in fact, just to summarize, how do we, in fact, guarantee meaningful participation at all stages, and how do we assure that people are not losing interest in participatory processes? Because very often, at least in Latin America, and I assume that here you're observing the same, is that even though we are opening more and more spaces for meaningful participation, somehow and for some reasons we are losing civil society organizations and interested people. So we're closing one cleft and another one is opening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mila. And I don't see any more interventions from the floor, so I will turn back to our panelists for 1 or 2 minutes pledge your commitment for reinforcing civic and civil participation in decision making going forward with our Human Rights 75 initiative. Thank you.
Feminist leadership, putting in the center of our decisions, in our working with others, care, equal recognition of all, and inclusion. I think this is something that is very much practiced inside civil society organizations and more. And this is a current that is also practiced inside local municipalities in the current called municipalism, that really puts participation, co-creation, and the commons through a feminist leadership perspective at the core of decision making. So I think this is very inspirational.
Yeah, I wish I could pledge on behalf of the European Commission, but I'm not in a position to do that. From a personal and professional point of view, I think my pledge would be to act in the most diligent and professional and open way, listen to our stakeholders, and use our creative brains to do and implement policies that are bringing these issues forward, to promote and protect and guarantee human rights, fundamental rights, in all the work that we can. So that is a big pledge, but that is at least within my remit that I promise to do.
Yes, I think we do in our department have pledges to make, especially to continue about development for more influence society in EU development policy, but we also are deepening our work on CSO enabling environments around the world and our human rights defenders protection work. But I think one of the things I think is very important that's happening nowadays, which I think is a great improvement, especially for European civil society, is that we're really trying to improve the internal, external coherence about European policies towards civic space, and I think that's something that I would commit to continuing.
Thank you, Stefans. Thank you, speaker, for engaging with us in such a rich and interesting discussion. From my end, I pledge to ensure that space and participation remain at the core of our work, and that this topic can also fit into the Human Rights 75 campaign and a high-level event that is being planned in December 2023, and then the outcome of that will in turn contribute to the 2024 Summit for the Future. So we very much look forward to our work on how each one of us can help to strengthen the space for civil society and what further avenues we can find for inclusive and meaningful participation of all our stakeholders in Europe and beyond. And also one takeaway I got from this discussion is that we need to use a simpler language to reinforce the universality of human rights. Thank you very much.